Welcome to Sacred Realms. It's a great day in Hyrule, y'all. Welcome to Sacred Realms, a Zelda Retrospective Podcast. I'm your host, Lyndon Willoughby. I am joined again this week after his 1 week hiatus by co-host Matt Willoughby. How you doing, Matt?
Oh, I'm fantastic. I'm so glad to be back. I really missed recording. We tried really hard to make it work the 1 week that I couldn't be here. We even rescheduled 2 or 3 times, and just it never ended up working out. And I have to admit, I was very sad when it came down to the night, and I was on an airplane. Actually, I was delayed in my airport for over 2 hours, and then was on an airplane and was like, Lyndon is recording with the bros from Hyrule Podcasters, and I'm here on a plane after being stuck in an airport for over 2.5 hours. So, I would have much rather have been here, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah. And it actually feels like a lot longer ago than it will to our listeners, because the episode that we're talking about, where it's just me and Ben and Pat from Hyrule Podcasters, actually will be releasing the day after we're recording this episode. So there will be like a 1 week span of time for all of our listeners. For us, it's been like 2 weeks, because we actually ended up padding out this front half of the season again with another bonus episode.
We got lots of those coming in.
Yeah, well, we had our first one with Phil Summers. That seemed like a really good one to do. And then we weren't planning on having another one, but then out of the clear blue sky, Nintendo drops a direct on us. And
as they do.
Yeah, and against all odds, this one actually contained
Zelda,
like worthy of speaking about on our podcast. So, we had to have a little bonus episode about that, again with Hyrule Podcasters. So we're back to our regularly scheduled programming this week, which is great because we've got a rank and recap episode to get to. Those are always a great time. Of course, longtime listeners of our show will know that Matt and I never do a rank and recap episode, at least since Ocarina of Time. Did we do one for Ocarina of Time? Or did we have a third person for Ocarina of Time?
We didn't have a third person.
Okay,
no.
Cool. So every single one since Ocarina of Time, we have had a third person join us so that we might have a tiebreaker. Yeah, we might have a tiebreaker vote in the event that needed to happen. And it actually has happened once or twice before. So
indeed.
Yeah. So that was a good decision. Of course, the last few times out, that has been Mike the Detective. But for this one, we felt like bringing in a different perspective. Maybe somebody who, has been going on this journey playing this game for the first time with us. Felt very appropriate to bring back Max Nichols of Bungie. How you doing, Max?
Hi, I'm doing great. I will struggle to fill the big shoes of Mike the Detective, but I'm doing great.
Glad to hear it. I mean, yeah, Mike brings like a certain salty earthiness to the proceedings, and yeah, that's his whole vibe. But you know what? You've got your own special qualities, and we wouldn't have it any other way. So there you go.
I come to the table. I bring to the table like clinical dweeb. That's my thing.
Clinical dweeb energy. I like it.
I think that's highly complimentary. Yeah.
I was gonna say which Enneagram is that? Oh man, no, we're really happy to have you back on for this one, Max. I know, we've already had a great discussion about our kind of mutual findings in this game earlier in the season, but it's a big deal for all of us to have beaten this game for the first time. And it just felt appropriate that all three of us could kind of give it an official score and some final thoughts on this episode together before we moved on to what is potentially an even more controversial, next experience.
I wouldn't say potentially, definitely a more controversial experience. It's going to be something, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think the reputation that Zelda 2 holds is certainly more controversial and more,
no doubt.
There's a lot more polarity to people's opinions about it than there are even about this game. So that'll be fun. But we're not here to talk about Zelda 2.
Not yet.
Max, you have beaten The Legend of Zelda, correct?
I have. For the first time.
Question. Did you use your own hand-drawn map through the whole thing?
Well, I think he said he put that down after a while, right?
I did not. I put it down after a while, and then I didn't pick it back up again. I mapped the whole, what direction is that? Eastern half of Hyrule. And then I kind of was like, yep, okay, I had enough of this. And then I didn't map anymore. I recently found out that when they designed the map for Zelda 1, Takashi Tezuka and Shigeru Miyamoto, the two designers on Zelda 1, the co-creators of Zelda, they sat down with a long piece of paper. Miyamoto drew the eastern half of the map, and Tezuka drew the western half. So apparently, as soon as I finished mapping Miyamoto's half of the map, I got bored of it. I don't know if
Wow, that's crazy. So did they just... Okay, that's actually kind of confuses me. Where was the dividing line? Because the river isn't exactly the halfway point.
I think it was the middle of the paper they were using, which is about the exact middle of the map. They just split it in half.
Wow.
A single sitting. They designed the whole overworld in a sitting.
Well, now that's incredible. I guess looking at the map right now, that sort of makes sense because the glade where you start is basically in the smack middle of the map, and then if you draw a line straight up from there, it covers like there's a few little bush areas, but for the most part, it hits the lake, which does have a dungeon, and then river, and then lots of scenery that you can't like actually traverse. So I think it actually is pretty easy to see where this could have been, designed by two separate people moving towards one central area. Like there's not a whole lot of complexity in the way that those two halves sort of meet.
Yeah, and also, would we say that Miyamoto kind of took the easy way out by taking up a solid, I don't know, call it eighth of his portion with a non-traversable ocean?
Well, Tezuka took up eighth of his with identical graveyard screens, so...
and the Lost Woods, so that's fair, I guess.
I should correct myself. They didn't fully design it in a single sitting, but they did do a first draft, which is very similar to the final design in a single sitting. And then they iterated on it from there, apparently.
I will say that just kind of looking at it now, it does appear that Miyamoto's half has got more like sneaky little nooks and crannies of the two. Like you've got the secret like stairway area up in the top, like the northeast corner. You've got the heart chamber that
that's
you have to
off
like sail
on the
to.
corner. Yeah.
Miyamoto's section has got the shrub that you have to burn to get into that dungeon. There's like I'm looking at Phil's map that's got all the points of interest numbered, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm noticing a lot more of like the secrets that I remember stumbling across, bombable walls and burnable trees and all that stuff. It just seems like there's a few more kind of happening over on the Miyamoto side of the world. I don't know if that speaks to like his philosophy in doing this a bit more so than Tezuka's, but
it's hard to say because it's also like Miyamoto also has like the first half, and towards the latter half, like the game is a lot more just like combat-y. It's just like, can you get to the dungeon? And then when you're in the dungeon, can you get to the end of the dungeon? Like by the time you're ranging into the far western side of the map, like you're at the end of the game.
Yeah, it's chock full of enemies, like herds of various colored Lionels that are just running around with, and then there are a ton of Armos in that top northwestern section of the map, and I don't know, like they're very different, and the design philosophies are very, very different. So I can see for sure.
Like as soon as I read this, I looked at the map and was like, oh yeah, these are like, you can almost see where the authorship changes and like the different persons started drawing. Like this, it's hard to put a finger on like exactly why that is, but like they feel different.
Yeah, it's definitely there.
Yeah. I would say that for one thing, the Miyamoto half of the map definitely feels a bit more maze-like. I think the Tezuka half of the map feels a bit more structured to a pretty firm grid you know? And it's a little bit less meandering, just kind of looking at the layout right now. So, yeah.
Well,
interesting.
And let's see, like Tezuka doesn't get as much credit as Miyamoto, but he really is like co-inventor of the Zelda series, right? Like he's the guy who designed the original Link design, and he did most of the monsters for Zelda 1, and he was the game director for Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. So it's interesting to see the other Zelda creators kind of like personal touch here.
Yeah, definitely. Did Tezuka have much like lingering involvement with Nintendo or the Zelda series very far past this game? Like his is not a name that crops up nearly as often, at least in recent Zelda history, as Miyamoto's.
Yeah, so up until Ocarina of Time, he was involved in most of the Zelda games, except for Zelda 2. He wasn't involved in Zelda 2, but he was like a major influence on Zelda 1, 3, and 4. And Link's Awakening, like it was primarily Tezuka. He was in charge. Miyamoto was barely involved at all with Link's Awakening. Afterwards, Tezuka took on more of like a guidance, like advisory role. Like he was not really involved with Ocarina of Time. He was a little bit involved with the Wind Waker, and he was involved with like the Capcom, the Oracle games as kind of like a Nintendo side supervisor. But the last Zelda game that was really like a Tezuka Zelda game was Link's Awakening.
Well, what a game that was. And I mean,
yeah, I was going to say he scored high marks on our ranking then.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, I feel like it's actually pretty impressive in the history of Zelda games to be able to say like, oh, any one of these games was like a game of this person's like, you know, heavy influence, right? Like to be able to say that Link's Awakening is a Tezuka game and be able to ascribe like a lot of the uniqueness of that game to maybe his direction is really cool, because I think a lot of Zelda games, we know the names of the key players, you know, like,
I mean, some of you do,
you know, Eiji Aonuma and Shigeru Miyamoto, and like a lot of the big names kind of tend to recur, but like, I don't know. I feel like it's not very often that somebody over there who's kind of in a decision-making role really kind of just does something weird, you know? And Link's Awakening was definitely that.
Yep, definitely.
But weird in a good way.
In a good way. He described it as almost a parody of Zelda.
That's an interesting description. Especially only 3 games in, or 4.
Yep. In a way that I've never realized before until I played Zelda 1, Link's Awakening is very much an homage to Zelda 1 in a ton of ways.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that a lot, especially towards the back part of the game. Wandering through a lot of Death Mountain felt very similar to Telltale Heights, with the, you know, mostly the landscape. I mean, obviously very rocky, but the screen movement and the I don't know, it's just
kind of like the geographical arrangement of like the last chunk of the game.
Yeah, it felt similar, and like obviously I would say that they're not like the northwest portion of the map is where you get into the Death Mountain stuff for Zelda 1, and then Telltale Heights is more just like the whole like north quadrant basically.
Well, I think a lot of where that feeling probably comes from too is the fact that when you think about it, The Legend of Zelda and Link's Awakening are the only 2 top-down Zelda games that have a static overworld that you exist in the whole time that you're there. All the other top-down games, you have some sort of like movement between different planes of existence in some way. Like, you know, in A Link to the Past, you've got the light world and the dark world. And then in A Link Between Worlds, you have Hyrule and Lorule. And the Capcom games, you know, Oracle of Ages, you're moving between the past and the present. And in Oracle of Seasons, you're manipulating the landscape between, you know, seasons, and it can feel different in that way. And then what was the other one? I had another one right at the oh, and then Minish Cap.
Yeah,
obviously you're shrinking. So I mean, I think that if nothing else, they're very similar in that way. And I'm sure that if they had the power to do it, maybe they would have done something similar in Link's Awakening, but that didn't happen. And so, yeah, I think that's a big similarity that sort of comes to mind right off the cuff for me.
So not to get us off topic again, especially into the game that we're playing next, but Zelda 2, it's not a top-down, it's a side-scroller, right? Like that's why we're not kind of lumping it into that segment, because to my understanding, Zelda 2 also doesn't have any of those map manipulative mechanics, but it's not a top-down, it's a side-scroller, right?
Mostly, yeah.
Okay.
Gameplay happens in a side view.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in all the ways that are impactful, I think my understanding is that it's not entirely fair to describe it as a top-down Zelda in the way it like, for the purposes of this conversation, I don't think it falls under that umbrella.
Okay. It's its own thing. It's unique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Well, we'll, of course, dig more into that later down the road as we actually start playing that game and talking about it. But we came here today to put a bow on our experience with the original Legend of Zelda. So let's go ahead and dive right into that. I'm going to get some housekeeping out of the way before we go ahead and start. If you didn't know, Sacred Realms is a weekly re-examination of The Legend of Zelda, one little slice at a time. Sacred Realms drops every Wednesday and is available on all major podcast networks. Every week we play a new section of a Zelda game, and then we sit down here to talk and to drop our hot takes. If that sounds fun to you, excuse me. If that sounds fun to you, please head over to Apple Podcasts, hit that subscribe button, and be sure to leave us a review. 5-star reviews are greatly appreciated, and they have a chance to get a shout out here on the show. If you want more Sacred Realms in your life, you can head over to patreon.com/Sacred Realms Pod to get access to our Discord channel, write in listener mail, vote on what game we play next, and so much more. In addition, one of the benefits that Master Sword patrons and above get is that we read their names every week here on the show. Those legendary individuals are Darknuck, Brian, George, Mike, Dylan, Allie, Lennon, Kolku, Rowan, Josh, Nick, Keep It Going, Dante, Gep, Mary, Brittany, Davey, Haru the Mighty, Derek, Albert, Mark, Andy, Cameron, Tyler, Ben, Daniel, Nick D_TV, Travis, Christian, Jonathan, Hyrule Interviews, aka the guest of the evening, Max Nichols, Garrett, and Drew. We could not make the show without your generous support. We appreciate you all so very much. But without further ado, let's get into the Sacred Realms recap. This is, of course, the section of the podcast where previously once per season, now twice this season, because we're reviewing 2 games within the course of this season, we break down the game that we just played. We break it down into 6 parts. We discuss a variety of things about our experience. And then at the very end, we come together to rank it and review it against the other games in the series that we have played. Of course, if you need a reminder just at the top of this whole thing about where our ranking currently stands, this is where we're at. In 5th place, we've got A Link to the Past. In 4th place, we have Link's Awakening. In 3rd place, we have Skyward Sword. In 2nd place, we have Ocarina of Time. And in 1st place, we have Breath of the Wild. Where will The Legend of Zelda rank at the end of this discussion? We will have to see. Let's go ahead and get into part 1 of the Sacred Realms recap, which is the plot. And you know, here's the thing, Max. I'm reading down, so just a bulleted list of what we're about to get into here. We've got part 1, which is the plot. Part 2 is best dungeon. Part 3 is best item. Part 4 is best music. And part 5 is the best bloopy trail. It was previously side quest, but we've kind of...
Bloopy trail's better.
Yeah, bloopy trail is just kind of what we're going with now. And then, of course, part 6 is our final thoughts. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Max, but I feel like some of these, as they've been the entire season thus far, are just going to be just really a stretch to discuss.
Yeah, I would say so. This first Zelda game barely has some of these elements. I mean, especially plot, of course. And dungeon is pretty thoroughly covered, but still good to pick a best. I think the rest we can get into. It's just there might not be as much interesting back and forth.
Oh, don't you worry. We're going to find some nice trickety trick ways to kind of like actually have these conversations.
We're going to make it work.
Whether it's supported by the gameplay or not.
We're going to headcanon our way into some crazy plot or something.
We're going to make some content here, y'all. We're going to pull it out of thin air and will it into being. So talking about the plot, I know that obviously we've got a very bare bones story to sort of discuss here, but I do want to bring a few points into the discussion right up top, in favor of my opinion, which is that maybe there's actually a little bit more to discuss here than we're kind of giving it credit for. Of course, we do have some plot elements that are given to us at the beginning of the game and through the game manual. We've discussed that a lot in this season about how the entire backstory of this game really is provided to us via supplemental elements, right?
Supplemental?
Yes.
It means extra.
Yeah, it means, yeah. But I think you know, for the purposes of this discussion, we can consider those as being necessary elements of the gameplay experience, right? Because that was the intention of the people who made it. Is that fair to say, Max?
Absolutely.
Cool. So when you take that into account and you realize that, one, we've got a backstory that has been given to us to kind of set up this gameplay experience. We've got a cast of characters. It's not large, but we do have one, and it's a pretty impactful one. Obviously, a lot of very famous Zelda characters make their first appearance here. And then on top of that, I think we actually have some very interesting connections to the wider Zelda lore, which we have discussed quite a lot on this show. And it is a frequent topic that we return to, and I think it's perfectly fair to at least allow that to kind of shade this conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Makes it more interesting, if nothing else.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'm going to send it to you first, Max. Obviously, we all kind of knew what we were getting into here. We knew that this was not going to be a Skyward Sword. It was not going to be a Twilight Princess as far as the story is concerned. But did you find yourself enjoying, I guess, the atmosphere and the experience that this game was kind of taking you through?
I very much did. There's a sort of isolation, almost melancholy that I take away from the world of Zelda 1 and the experience of wandering around it. Like, we know that disaster has befallen this land, right? Like, the princess has been kidnapped. A king of monsters has appeared. But like, it feels like there's ruins, and you don't really see other people, but you spend a lot of time alone with your thoughts and, you know, maybe 500 Octoroks or something along the way. But like, you see that in like Breath of the Wild. Like, Breath of the Wild has this very like melancholy feel to it, and I think that was like a direct connection to how people imagined and how they felt when they played Zelda 1. I feel like there's a straight line you can draw there.
And I think that's I'm sorry, Lyndon, I know you're about to say something, but I just want to say, I think that's an interesting choice, especially for the first game in a series. Like, it's an interesting tone to set for what I assume Nintendo wanted to become the flagship franchise that it is, right? I mean, it's when you think Nintendo, you think Mario and you think Zelda. And I think it's interesting that the first game out of the gate, they intentionally set this tone of loneliness and melancholy, because you're right, that's exactly how you feel even from the beginning. And I don't know, that's bold.
There are some things that I think we have to bear in mind with this discussion, which is that, one, we've mentioned it before, but I think the technical capability to do much more than this was not really present at the time. Right. So there is that. In some ways, I think that this vibe and this emptiness that we're talking about was just a necessity of the time. But another thing is that I think what you said, Matt, is really interesting, where we're like, well, yeah, I mean, this is, you know, when you think Nintendo, you think Mario and you think Zelda. Right. But we have to remember that when these games are being developed, even Mario. Right. Mario kind of is the franchise for Nintendo. But back when all of these games were being made, I think a lot of what was happening was experimental. It was very like, let's try something out, let's throw it at the wall and see what sticks, right? And Mario and Zelda and Metroid to an almost equal extent all kind of stuck, and they've all kind of evolved into other things. But I do think the point is interesting that much more modern Zelda games have kind of gone back to this feeling of melancholy and emptiness and kind of expounded upon it in maybe a more intentional way. I think from even a lore standpoint, it's very interesting because we do know, especially if you've read Hyrule Historia, that the timeline this game takes place in, I mean, it's called the Downfall timeline. And I think I think what we're supposed to understand is that this version of Hyrule is very much a kingdom in decline, like very far past its prime. It's not grand in the way that the kingdom of Hyrule and like the Child timeline, for instance, went on to be. And then also we have to remember that I think it's been confirmed, and we're taking it as gospel, that this game does not even necessarily take place in the entirety of Hyrule, right? We're going throughout this adventure in like a very secluded part of what we consider to be the Hyrule continent. I don't know if you can call it that or not, but so all of those things together, it's all interesting, like context and shading. I don't think any of it changes my base feeling, which is that I agree with you, Max, that whatever the reasons, the result is something that actually is surprisingly effective for a game of this age.
Yeah, I actually kind of want to push back a little bit on the idea that this was the result of technical constraints.
Oh, really?
Because like most other NES era games didn't have this kind of emotional tenor to them, right? It was very unusual at the time for a game to evoke emotions other than kind of like, action, driving forward. Like when we get to, Zelda 2, I think you'll find has a very different emotional tone to it. I won't delve into that too much more than that. But so I don't think they necessarily set out with the intention of making it feel this way, but I think that they were aware that it was going in this way and embraced it. Or decided to accept that was the kind of game they were making. A mix of serendipity and intention at play there.
Because I know, like, obviously, we know that it was the intention for Link to feel like this like stalwart solitary explorer, right? And we also know that the intention was to set this world up as one that had some antiquity to it. These labyrinths have ancient treasures and whatnot. And so I do think that your point is a good one, Max, to where, maybe this is something that like just felt right as they were kind of going through the development process and just decided to kind of lean into it. And in fairness, I think that is a tone that most Zelda games have in some, measure, right? As Link is that kind of stalwart explorer in a land of antiquity to some extent, but it's not usually quite as pervasive as it is here. I think that the simplicity really does afford us the opportunity to kind of imprint a lot of our own imagination on what is kind of happening here. One thing that I really loved about playing through this game from a story perspective was actually, we've mentioned this before, but having access to both the game manual with its own artwork of like enemies and locations and whatnot, but also having Phil Summers' game guide, which has his artistic interpretations of these areas. What I kind of found was that even though obviously the in-game, like the graphical capabilities were not able to like render these spaces in that grand of a way, I was still able to kind of take that supplementary material and like imprint it upon my experience. And I don't know, I think for that reason, it felt just as much like a living, breathing Zelda world to me as any others have.
Yeah, I had the same experience.
Matt, would you say that kind of drawing on that extra material, especially in Phil's guide, was kind of a big part of your enjoyment that you were able to sort of put into this game as well?
Yeah, I don't remember which episode it was that we talked about this. I think it was the episode where we had to drain the lake to find the dungeon. And in Phil's guide, what you see is, instead of a 4x4 pond, you see a massive actual lake,
like a Lake Hylia looking.
Exactly.
Thing. Yeah.
And in the middle is a stalwart island with a little castle sitting on top that's got, the seaweed draping off of it and whatnot. And that was that kind of drove it home for me that, like, man, all of this art, and as amazing as it is, it's putting me into a headspace of this game is more than just the pixels on the screen. And it helped me, as someone who doesn't do this much. I'm not artistic. I'm not going to say I'm not imaginative, but like, that kind of imagination doesn't come easily to me. It really helped to frame this very primitive, basic game into a much more grand, much more, there's a word that I am searching for here. It gave it much more ambiance than it otherwise would have had. And it definitely massively improved my experience with the game.
Well, of course, when we're talking about, I guess, our powers of imagination and the extent to which they can enhance the gameplay experience. Of course, that applies to the world that we're traversing, but it's got to also apply to the characters that we're meeting and interacting with and taking control of in the case of Link. So let's talk about the 3 main characters that we have in this game. Really, what we have is a main character, and then we've got a few important plot points,
plot devices
that take the forms of like characters, right? But we've got our Link, we've got Zelda, we've got Ganon, and then I'm going to give an honorable mention to Impa, who, if we're talking about the plot, then I guess Impa needs to be brought into the discussion as well, even though we don't see her in the game, right? But let's just go ahead and talk about Link. I mean, Max, I think you have done more research into the genesis of this game and this series than either of us have. You've read all of the important interviews. You've mentioned some of them on this show about, where did the idea for Link come from? What does the name Link even mean? What is what's the genesis of this character? And so I think, do you feel like Nintendo's goals for Link as a character were successful in this game?
Yeah. I would say so. History tells us that it was. But in context, the genesis of Link as a character is pretty simple. Like, he's a visual design and a very, very lightly detailed background, right? Like, we know they intended for him to be a child or a kid, or a very young adult, like that range. And a lot of that was because some of the inspiration that like Miyamoto was taking, and presumably Tezuka were taking as well, what was like feelings that they got as children, exploring the countryside. There's quotes where Miyamoto specifically talks about like wanting to capture feelings that he experienced as a kid. That feeling of, when you're a kid, the things that you find outside, whether it's in your backyard or in the woods or in the mountains, it feels much more momentous. It feels like a bigger deal. And everything feels bigger and larger than life as a kid compared to as an adult. So, like, these are feelings he was specifically going after. So it was important for it to be a kid that you're playing as. And Tezuka is the guy who designed Link's visuals, right? Like, he did the sprite for Link, and I believe the sprite predates most of the character art. I can't 100% confirm that right now, but they went with kind of a Peter Pan look intentionally. Like, that's an explicit reference that they've made, was to Peter Pan, and the tunic kind of clothing evokes, medieval kind of explorer kind of feeling to them. And Peter Pan's cap, and overall, like, the contrast between his like brown pants and green tunic and brown arms, was something that read well in a sprite at the resolution they had at the time. It was the same kind of reason they designed Mario. It was like a functionality thing first and foremost, where they wanted you to be able to visually see his limbs in contrast with his body. So those are kind of the two big kind of directions that Link was designed towards. One was to evoke that feeling of like childlike exploration and wonder, and the other one was very functional, like what can players visually parse in our art style.
Right. And I think it's so interesting because I think when I think of Link from these early games, for some reason in my head, I'm always seeing the Link from the Link's Awakening and Link to the Past manuals, who I think is a bit more of a young adult than anything else. Like I think Knight in Training is sort of the vibe you get from that Link, you know? And having gone back and actually looked at the manual for this game and the artwork that was released for this game, I think you're definitely right. It very intentionally kind of portrays this Link as being younger than that.
I mean, he's probably 12 or 14-ish.
I mean, yeah, it's tough to like put an actual age on it, but it definitely does not have like this Link is definitely missing an adult quality that later ones have, like that the immediately later ones have. And I think that's really cool. Like it's nice to know that was somewhat of an intentional choice. And like, I think I always kind of chalked it up to like, I don't know, the fact that this Link looks a little goofier, and maybe that's just because there hadn't been some refinement on the character. Because he does, right? He looks kind of goofy.
Yeah, no, I mean, the art style, it's really hard to put an age to him because he's kind of cartoony, kind of squished looking. And I guess you find out late, like we all found out later when Adventure of Link came out that like Adventure of Link was 16, I guess. And it's meant to take place several years after Zelda 1. So Zelda 1 Link is like 12. I guess is the idea.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it's so funny because when you say squished, like the comparison that immediately comes to mind for me is like the Legend of Zelda Link is like Link via Dragon Ball, and a Link to the Past Link is a little bit more Dragon Ball Z, I guess.
You never watched Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball
yes,
Z?
I have. I have a very shallow experience with both things, but I do have a little enough to render an artistic comparison. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I found the quote that is maybe my very favorite quote from Miyamoto about the inspiration for Zelda 1. So I'm just going to read it. So Miyamoto says, "The spirit, the state of mind of a kid when he enters a cave alone must be realized in the game. Going in, he must feel the cold air around him. He must discover a branch off to one side and decide whether to explore it or not. Sometimes he loses his way. If you go to the cave now as an adult, it might be silly, trivial, a small cave. But as a child, in spite of being banned to go, you could not resist the temptation. It was not a small moment then."
Yeah.
End quote.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially given a lot of what we've said throughout the season, right? Which is that these are dungeons in a strict sense of the word, right? Like they're dungeons, but they are nothing in complexity or difficulty in comparison to the dungeons of the Zelda that, we grew up with, specifically meaning Lyndon and I, like the Ocarina of Time, the Majora's Mask, even Link's Awakening, or like the complexity of dungeon here now playing it as an adult is like, I don't want to say trivial, but it's definitely a lot less. And I think that they captured that well. Especially the whole, do you explore one branch or do you keep going along the main line? Like, especially when you don't have going into the dungeon, the map or anything, it's a, as we discovered in the first couple of dungeons, you can immediately find the end of each of those. Yeah. And if you don't explore, you don't find what you need. Yeah.
Well, when we think about dungeons in Zelda, I think we typically are thinking of temples, right? Of like ziggurats, of like incredibly complex, ancient palaces and whatnot. And in this game, I think it's so funny, that quote, Max, because now what I'm thinking is like, yeah, actually my impression of most of this game world being made up of dinky caves and like a few crypts is actually more accurate and
is exactly what they were going for.
and is actually like more appropriate to the original vision of the game. And I actually love that. Like, I think, just because we don't have quite that sense of like scale here, I don't think that really takes away from this at all. It really does. It makes me wish. I know we had this conversation on the last episode you were on, Max, where we all sort of felt like this game was not in need of a modern remake, right?
Or it would be hard to remake it to modern tastes without altering what it is. Yes.
That being said, I wish this is a completely unrealistic wish, because it would never happen. There's no this would not be a profitable thing to do. I don't think. And but as a piece of art, I would love for some enterprising individual to escape the confines of Nintendo copyright and come up with have you heard of the Kanto Redrawn project, Max?
Yes.
Gotcha. So, I mean, to explain to our listenership what this is, if you don't know, there are artists online who, for some of the older Pokemon games, I know they've done it for the Kanto region and also for the Johto region, have kind of gone back and basically made a much more intricate pixel art version of those game worlds. And they've done it not for the purposes of creating a remaster of the game and its actual gameplay experience, but more just to kind of, I guess, give more complexity and voice to, it's more of an art piece, right? An interactive art piece where you can kind of dive into that world just a little bit more via slightly more intentional visuals and whatnot. I would love, Max, did you just link me to exactly what I'm talking about right now?
Yep. Hashtag Hyrule Redrawn.
Max
pixel art.
I wished it, and thus it came into being. Oh man, I'm actually going to have to take a look at this, and we'll post this in the Discord as well. And honestly, probably we'll probably just post it to Twitter as well, because everyone deserves to see it if you haven't already. But this is exactly what I'm talking about, Max. A pixel reimagining of some of these spaces that is more complex, certainly in its graphical rendering. There's more colors being used. There's more detail here. But it's not changing the overall simplicity of the game world. And I love that so much, just because I think that this map and this overworld, this gameplay experience, this story, the small scale of it is, I think, almost more of a boon than it is anything else. In some ways, this actually helps set it apart from later top-down Zelda games, especially that came after it.
Yeah, I would say so. There's one interesting thing. I'm looking at some of these images here, and just for the listeners, a lot of people are basically taking screens from Zelda 1 and redoing them in art styles that are more reminiscent of Minish Cap or Link to the Past or other pixel art games. And one of the things that's happened when they're doing this is it looks closer in. You feel like you're closer to the action with these newer art styles.
Yeah.
And there's something about the very iconic, and I mean iconic as in it's made up of small icons.
Not iconic as in legendary or
representative of a of a whole thing. Yeah.
That makes Zelda 1 look almost like you're looking at a map, a medieval map or a hand-drawn map. With the monsters drawn on the corners and stuff. It looks like it's representative of the experience rather than directly portraying it.
Yeah.
And that's all happening in my head. That's just my psychology. I don't who knows what you're all experiencing, but
no, I'm right there with you. And I think honestly, a big theme of this entire discussion not to get too far ahead on my final thoughts, but I think we're going to keep coming back to this idea of like you get out of this game what you bring into it and what you're willing to kind of like add on to it on your own end of things. Like it's I know it's not exactly like reading a book, right? Because this is still a visual interactive medium, right? But it's a little bit like reading a novel in that way, in which you've got the boundaries of an experience and you can kind of bring extra imagination into that. And that can kind of aid you in kind of getting more emotion and more investment out of having gone through all of it. So I think that's probably what I would say is my main thesis for where I kind of landed with the plot of this game. Is that with the characters and the world and all of these areas, I think that I came to enjoy it very much, with the caveat that I brought a lot of that to the table myself and kind of like had the room to do that. And so I think that's a pretty great compliment. I know. So we've had our conversation about Link. Let's go ahead and talk about Zelda and Ganon real quick, because we do that in each of these recap episodes. And like I said earlier, these are very like primordial versions of these characters, right? Like whereas with Link, we've got a lot to talk about in terms of what was the impetus for the design of this character, and what was the developer logic for his creation. And I think that's a little harder to do with Zelda and Ganon, right? I mean, with Ganon, what we have is like, what's the baddest looking dude that we can have at the end of this game? And with Zelda, all we really have there is an NPC, like a plot giver, to tell you congratulations at the very end of this game. And to that point, I want to talk about Zelda first. And Matt, I'm going to send this question to you. Do you feel like this game actually deserved to be called The Legend of Zelda? Like, remove everything else, every past game, like, or every game that took place past this one. Do you feel like this game, like, would you have named it The Legend of Zelda had it been you?
No. And that's, I think that is always been a little bit of a question. Not nearly as much for the games that we started out with, right? But even with those games, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, etc., like the branding of the game being around Zelda as a character, especially seeing now firsthand where it started, where Zelda is literally just a plot device and has like 2 lines of dialogue at the end of the game. Like, I don't understand why Zelda is the titular, meaning giver of title,
yes,
character. Like, I don't know, Max, you are the only person I would know that might have a quote about why they chose to do it this way, other than it being an homage to Fitzgerald's wife, Zelda.
Yeah,
like I don't get it.
This is the part where Max tells you that in fact you're only 50% right in the base thought of this entire discussion.
I wish
which is why I kicked it to him. Yeah,
I wish I had an answer that would just like totally make it all fall into place. I don't really. I know the name Princess Zelda came, as you both mentioned, or no, it's named after Scott Fitzgerald's wife, Zelda Fitzgerald. But the name was suggested by like some rando Nintendo of America employee as part of like a branding strategy. Like Miyamoto and company were having a hard time coming up with a name that they liked. So somebody just threw a name out there. And like, so that it's I think it's called Legend of Zelda because it sounds cool. Is what it boils down to.
And of course, we have to remember that that's not even the game's name in its home territory.
Yeah, originally, well, you do the honors, Lyndon.
So, I mean, what's it called? The Hyrule Adventure, or
I don't know this actually. This is a tidbit of knowledge that I do not have.
In Japan, originally, it was called The Legend of Zelda, subtitle The Hyrule Fantasy. And their intention at the time was for the Hyrule Fantasy to be the name of the series, not The Legend of Zelda. And that kind of just got lost along the way. they kind of gravitated towards Legend of Zelda, partially I think because they didn't use the name Hyrule Fantasy in America, and it was a big seller in America. Like that was a big part of their business. So they're like, oh, I guess it's called Legend of Zelda now.
So I find that interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, the easy parallel there is Mario, right? Where it's same basic premise. Princess is kidnapped by Big Bad, except it's Princess Peach, obviously. They didn't call it The Legend of Peach or the Rescue of Peach or The Adventure of Peach. It was just Super Mario. But I think a key differentiator there for me is that technically Link is not the name of this character because you can name the character whatever you want. So I don't necessarily think them calling it like the Legend of Link would have made any sense unless they took away the opportunity for you to name your character.
Well, how much of Link's name is actually canon up front here, Max? I mean, obviously by the time we get to Zelda 2, which is subtitled The Adventure of Link, you know, the fact that like even though you could name your file whatever you wanted, it seemed like it's like, oh yeah, you can name your file whatever you want, but his name is Link, right?
I
don't. Sorry, go ahead.
I think they've always called the character Link. Like I've been reading old interviews, and like as early as Zelda 2 in the title of it, like they call it Link, the character. I do feel like you have a point though, Matt, which is like yeah, it would feel weird to name the character, weirder than it already does, to name the character anything other than Link, if they were like, yeah, this is the Legend of Link.
Yeah, like I don't think I've ever played a single Zelda game where I didn't name my character Link, like out of the gate. It just it's wrong. It feels wrong.
I played one where my character was named Thief.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
Link's Awakening.
That's funny.
I stole the bow.
That's funny.
I definitely, the first time I played Link's Awakening, I thought the main character was a pirate named Zelda. So, you know, I named my character Zelda.
I mean, but I feel like a lot of people have fallen into that over the. I mean, you know, it's a meme at this point, but it's like Zelda's the girl, right? Is like like the clarifying tongue-in-cheek like internet people, everyone having to tell their mom that like, yeah, the Link is not the one you're playing as, right? But as far as Zelda is concerned, I think that it's just so interesting because like I understand, I guess, where that thought came from, just in terms of like as a branding strategy, kind of trying to come up with something that sounded epic and mysterious, right, in that way. But it is still just so odd to me that Zelda is not a character I think that you even see mentioned in the game at any point before you meet her at the very end, right? Like, I know that we kind of have given Impa a pass on that because it's like, you know, sure, like I'm fine getting that element of the story in the manual, you know, but I feel like, I mean, the game isn't named The Legend of Impa or anything, right? I mean, the title character of the game is a character whose name you don't see on your screen. Like you don't see this character in any form at all until you've beaten the game. And I just think that that's so interesting to me.
So she is mentioned in the title scroll. Remember how
that's fair.
Yeah. Impa says you have to go rescue the Princess Zelda. Yeah, like that's
no.
true.
I mean, Impa isn't, but Zelda is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean. Is the title scroll, at least the way that I took it, was basically not exactly a word for word of what Impa told you, but it's a summarization of Impa's words, and in that it is.
Well, I understand.
You need to go save the Princess
I understand
Zelda.
your confusion, Matt, because we basically we read the plot deal in the manual and then immediately booted up the game. So
yeah,
like I can kind of see conflating those two things because there's some like repeat information that's kind of given to you there. But in fairness, you are right, Max. Zelda's name does appear in that title scroll.
So, yeah,
I guess that counts.
We'll give it a B- for grading scale on it being there.
Name wasn't mentioned in this title scroll like story bit, Ganon would be no more of a character than like Gleeok or Goma.
Is Ganon never mentioned by name outside of the title scroll?
I don't think so. Maybe one of the old men gives you a clue about it.
I don't, not to my recollection, and I also don't believe that Zelda mentions his name when you beat him and get to the very end of the game. I don't think the name Ganon is ever displayed in that text crawl. I could be mistaken, and I also could pull up a YouTube video right now and confirm that. I'm not going to.
We could do research, but we won't.
I do a little bit of research.
We do. We're not greatest generation. We do a little bit of research.
Yeah. Well, and you also have the king of Zelda research as a guest on your podcast right now, Matt. So
I know. Well, he does all the research for us and then tells us when we're wrong, which is why we have him on, because we're frequently wrong.
Right.
So I did just pull up a video, and the one line
that's why we have him
in the whole game is, "Thanks, Link, comma, you're the hero of Hyrule."
Well, there you go.
There you go. Yay!
Awesome. We couldn't even be bothered to be like, "Thank you, Link, for defeating Ganon, capital G, like
A-N-O-N.
Yeah, you were the hero of Hyrule,
Oh boy.
Man. I mean, very, very interesting. But yeah, I think, like we've said, there's not too much more that we can really get into about these characters. They're heavily primordial. They're very, they're sketches of characters that we come to know later on, but we can thank this game for introducing us to them in any way at all, and then build on that as a series going forward.
So just speaking about Ganon, since we're kind of coming to the close of the character summarization, Ganon is the big bad. He says something, I'm pretty sure, before you fight him, and then he dies and goes, "Arr!"
Yeah, then he collapses into like a pile of entrails.
Yeah, it was gory. Like they set that graphic to gore, and there it is. Boom.
I actually forgot you weren't on the episode where I was talking about this with Ben and Pat, Matt. But yeah, like I feel like this is maybe not quite as high up there as like Link stabbing Ganon in the face and then he vomits like blood
all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, but then it has to be green for like ratings purposes. It's not quite up to that level, but I mean, yeah, we definitely get like a little pile of Ganon guts right here at the very end of the game. So yeah,
fun.
That's fun. Do any of you have anything you want to say extra about the plot before we sort of move past that? Because I think we probably picked about all the meat off the bone that we really can.
I do think it's interesting that that Ganon that we see in this game and really in all of the early games is the bestial Ganon. And then Ocarina of Time is where Ganon becomes an actual like person. So I just want to say, like we did for Link to the Past, similar kind of just interesting story tidbit there that makes much more sense in the hindsight of Hyrule Historia telling us where this falls in the timeline of events. But yeah, having Bestial Ganon be the first version of Ganon and the second, and I think the third that you ever see is pretty crazy.
I do think one last thing to mention before we get out of the plot area is that, to my knowledge, this is the only Zelda game after Ocarina of Time in the timeline where Link and Zelda successfully reclaim the Triforce of Power.
It's
because that's how I interpreted it. Like, you beat Ganon, he drops a Triforce, and then in the final cutscene, Link and Zelda are both holding Triforces.
That is a good point. And I think that this game and Skyward Sword are the only two I can think of where
Link to the Past, Link gains the whole Triforce.
Oh, that's right. He wishes on the Triforce to rejoin the worlds and banish the Dark World. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting tidbit.
Yeah.
Well spotted.
Yeah. Thank you. Do my best.
My final thought there is just the most important character introduced in Zelda 1 is the Kingdom of Hyrule. As the resident map guy who likes the landscapes, it's my favorite character.
I mean, I think that's a totally valid point, and I think that referring to the overworld as a character is something that we haven't really done a whole lot of in this show up until now. We've certainly talked a whole lot about how we feel about the various overworlds and whatnot, but I think that's I think that that's a very good point, Max. I think that's in the same way as I don't know if you're a Star Trek guy at all, but in the same way that a lot of people refer to the Enterprise as a character, even though it's like the setting, you come to think of it in the same terms as like your main characters because it's just so ever present in that way. I think I do feel very samey.
It has like an arc over time, like it goes through. You have emotional connections to it. It's a stretch, but
you know what, Max?
I feel towards Hyrule like it's a character.
You say it's a stretch, but I'm willing to award the Kingdom of Hyrule as the best in class character award for the plot of The Legend of Zelda.
I will submit the various old men. Very facetiously. That is totally facetious. Yeah, no, I agree. I think the Kingdom of Hyrule, or this portion of the Kingdom of Hyrule, has a lot of personality that I didn't expect it to have, like at all. I didn't expect this overworld to have personality, but it really did. And the tone that we talked about kind of at the beginning of our breakdown here, I think is what made this game stand out to me way more than I thought it would.
Yep. Cool. Co-signed and agreed. Let's go ahead and move on to part 2 of the Sacred Realms recap, where we talk about what our favorite dungeon experience was in this game. Of course, we do have 9 distinct dungeons to talk about here. I think that there's actually a fun little competition to be had. I personally would not say that any of the early, certainly the first 3 dungeons, none of them would really be in the running for me here. But I do think that there's an interesting conversation to be had about the fun challenge that some of them did end up presenting. Max, did you have a favorite dungeon out of the 9 that you played?
I'm pulling up the list right now. To be completely honest, the dungeons in this game largely flow together in my memory. I have a really hard time attaching moments that I experienced to specific dungeons.
Yeah.
I actually was thinking the same thing. I was like, which dungeon did X, Y, or Z happen in? Was it that one? And then I have the list pulled up as well because I needed a refresher. But because you're right, they actually do. I think mostly because they were so close together and they were so short and we hit them all in pretty rapid succession that maybe that's contributing to it a little bit for me. But yeah, I have the same difficulty, Max.
I think the one that sticks out the most to me as a experience was level 6. Other than level 5. So level 5, of course, was the one where we encounter Blue Dark Nuts the first time.
The infamous level 5. Yes.
Level 6, I remember it's the one in the graveyard, right? It's got the whiz robes for the first time. And I went into level 6 after the experience level 5, which was this kind of brutal experience. And I went into level 6 with all the heart pieces, the magic sword. I bought the the ring that halves damage. So I went in with a huge upgrade from the previous dungeon, and I had a lot of fun fighting the whiz robes and stuff, especially in contrast to the previous dungeon. It's also the one. I think it's never mind. That's a different one. But yeah, so that's my pick. Level 6.
So I'm actually going to agree with you here, Max. That's the one I had pulled up as well. Dungeon 6, also known as Dragon. The reason that I really enjoyed this one is because, especially when you look at it from a layout perspective, this is... so the dungeons that you get to before this one all have a pretty linear path to them. They're pretty straightforward in their arrangement. And then with Dungeon 6, what you kind of have is a very linear front half, where there really is only one path to take. And then the entire back half is much more dense and involves staircases from one area to another that you have to traverse in order to get to the final boss and then to the Triforce piece. It's got kind of if you just look at it on the map once you get the map in this dungeon. Just seeing the layout is not quite enough to really carry you forward here. It is kind of arranged in a bit more of like a I don't know, in a bit more of a Matt, what's a word other than obtuse? I can't keep using obtuse.
No, it's our word. We have to put a nickel in the jar. The obtuse jar. Bonk.
Cool. There it is. Fine. So, it's definitely arranged in like in a bit more of a complex way. And I like it because that gives it the feel of having phases, which is something that a lot of other dungeons in later Zelda games have, where like the intro sections of a dungeon feel linear and simple, and then it opens up kind of in the back half and becomes more complex to traverse. In later Zelda games, of course, a lot of that comes from the collecting of items, which then change the way you interact with those dungeons. But even though that isn't the reason that this one kind of has that sort of tiered approach to me, I do think that it felt familiar regardless. I really do like that. And then the dungeons that you go to after level 6 all have the opposite effect of the introductory ones. They're all like they have no linearity to them, really. They're all just big rat's nests of cells that there's no exact rhyme or reason to why like to what order you're supposed to tackle them in, at least when you look at them from a layout perspective. And of course, that culminates in Death Mountain, which has no linearity at all. It's literally just a block of cells.
It's a mess.
Yeah.
I did not enjoy Death Mountain, to be honest. I know I wasn't on the episode, so I'm going to take 2 seconds to just kind of give my thoughts on Death Mountain. I just did not enjoy that dungeon. I think that it was way overly complicated. There were way too many rooms that had served no purpose other than to just mob you with difficult enemies that almost killed you. And like they didn't even give you items most of the time unless it was like 4 bombs. And yeah, I was not a fan of Death Mountain, to be honest. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Death Mountain has 50. So I made a chart counting how many rooms are in every dungeon, and I posted it in Discord the other day. But Death Mountain has 57 rooms. The next highest is Demon, which is 33.
Dang.
And
that's
then the
crazy.
Third highest is 25. So like Demon is already an outlier, and Death Mountain is like way above Demon.
Yeah. I think that for me, in simply to not just agree with y'all, even though I do, I would say Dragon is probably the best one. But
if you disagree with us, you're allowed.
I don't. I do agree with you that I think Dragon is the best one. But I did like Demon. And I think the reason that I liked Demon was the rehashing of many of the older bosses, and just like they were there to prove the point that you are not where you were at the beginning of this game. Like your power level, your ability, your combat awareness and style has progressed so significantly that all of these bosses are now just enemies that you can kill in a dungeon that don't really give you anything. Like it's pretty cool. I thought that was a very cool design choice, especially to have you refight Aquamentus specifically and just basically 2-shot that boss. Like it was, I thought that was a really cool, and I feel like maybe I'm wrong, but I felt like it was a very intentional thing that landed well for me in that dungeon.
Of just making it like driving home the point that you have become powerful.
Yeah. And like, that's really cool in ways. I think there aren't many other Zelda dungeons that I can think of where you rehash old bosses just as a course of making your way through the dungeon. So I kind of enjoyed that.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid. And I do agree with you, Matt, that I really enjoyed fighting a lot of those bosses. I think that even though a lot of them didn't have much interest or challenge for me when you fought them at the end of their respective dungeons the first time, they are a lot more fun when you have to fight, I don't know, like 3 of them in one dungeon. You know?
You have to fight the 3 dodgers at the same time. Yeah, that was neat.
Yeah. And when they're presented in that way, they actually help to make the dungeon a bit more fun from a combat perspective, because they do, even though the mechanics are simplistic, they do have mechanics, you know?
Yeah.
And it kind of helps to break up a little bit of the monotony of some of the other enemies. Not that a lot of the main enemies in these later dungeons are monotonous, right? Like, sure, their mechanics are non-existent, but just the sheer volume of them is incredibly difficult. But anyway, I do agree with you, Matt. It's fun fighting a lot of those bosses in the later dungeons. Now that we've all said our favorite dungeon, Max, I actually had kind of an interesting prompt for you that I wanted to ask before we get out of this section.
Yeah.
If you were to pick any element of dungeon design in this game that has not necessarily been carried forward, but you would love to see explored more intentionally in future Zelda games, what would it be?
That is a very interesting question. It would probably be the idea that dungeons can have value without beating them, or that you can beat a dungeon without extracting all its value. So the most obvious version of this is the key system in Zelda 1 being totally different from how it is in any other Zelda game, where all other Zelda games, keys are per dungeon. They can only be used in the dungeon you acquire them in. They're all totally interchangeable, like almost like a currency in this game, where you could take them from one dungeon to another. And I think there's a very interesting world to explore there. And it also shows up in this idea that, like, I think you guys talked about this with Joshua, but the idea of like going into a dungeon, getting an item, and then like leaving that dungeon and using that item elsewhere. Like this idea that it'd be worth exploring partway through a dungeon. I think those are both interesting things that have basically not been touched at all in Zelda games beyond this one.
Yeah. And I think that to carry that forward, we've got versions of that to a small extent in later Zelda games. The ones that kind of come to mind immediately are like in Ocarina of Time. There are early dungeons that have like heart pieces hidden in them, but you have to come back with bombs, right, in order to get to those. That happens in several other Zelda games. But I think the example that I gave in the episode with Josh was that I would love for there to be some iteration of like, like in the example I gave at the time, I was saying that the sequel to Breath of the Wild, because at the time we didn't have a name for it. We have a name now. If Tears of the Kingdom came out and it had like dungeons that you could just freely enter and exit, but you were incentivized to maybe come back with more items later to find more plot advancing things or whatever, I think that would be cool. But yeah, I definitely agree with you, Max. I think that there's definitely a world in which it could be explored, where dungeons not necessarily being a very linear one and done thing. I think that there's really something to dig into there, and I'd like to see that.
I do think it's like a fraught, like it's a dangerous route to go down, because it would be so easy to just make that a slog or make it annoying. Like, I have to go back to this dungeon, or like, is it worth going back when it's just a heart piece? Like those kind of thoughts are going to be in players' heads. So like threading the needle might be hard, but I do believe they could do it successfully. Yeah.
I think the one that, so my answer to this question is going to be that I actually would like to see dungeons that are designed with this density of spaces make a return, especially in a future top-down Zelda game. I don't know that this is as applicable to any of the 3D ones, but like in the next top-down Zelda game that we get, I would love for there to be dungeons that are maybe as just like a rat's nest of just cells, some of which you don't necessarily need to go to. I think what would make the difference between it being frustrating, which it was for me here, and actually being a fun thing is something that has been added to lots of Zelda games between this one and now, which is the ability to annotate your own map in game. And yeah. I think that like those two things combined could result in some fun experiences.
It's interesting because like they have had like a lot of the rooms in Zelda 1 are pretty samey, right? And oftentimes it's like, go into this room, it's a big square, maybe there's some pieces of cover, kill all the enemies here. And like we've had that experience in other Zelda games in the form of like the Trials of the Sword or whatever, that like the 50 caves you can go down in Twilight Princess. Like those are kind of this very just combat in a standard room kind of experiences. So like if you took those and like threw like some branching paths through them, then suddenly you're pretty close to a Zelda 1 dungeon in 3D.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's true. It's like I said, this is a tough balance to pull off, and I understand. I understand why it hasn't been done necessarily like this since this time, but I just think it's an interesting kernel of an idea to maybe explore at some point. I mean, we're not exactly like lousy with top-down new Zelda games, so who knows?
And I definitely wasn't trying to undercut your idea there. Like I didn't mean that it's like, oh, they already did this, it sucked. It was more like, this like here's an interesting starting point to help imagine what it might be like.
Oh yeah, no, I got you. I was tracking with you.
No, Lyndon, your idea is terrible.
Man, well, they can't all be winners, you know. So we took a quick break here. We're going to launch into our next section. Real quick before we do that, Max, I had one thing I wanted to say to you real quick. While we were all stepped away, I was looking through some of these Hyrule redrawn and Koholint redrawn screens that you sent over. I think it's really interesting. I feel like the Koholint redrawn ones actually hold a lot less interest for me than the Hyrule redrawn ones. Like I'm looking at this and I think they're like the artists are trying to find more areas to add complexity where I think less complexity was needed. Like I'm looking at the comparisons and I think that there was actually less room. Like there were less gaps of imagination, I guess, for me from the original to these.
Well, also you have a excuse me, a more nostalgic view of that game, and also we recently have that Switch HD remaster, which is amazing. So I feel like there's probably just a less of a
okay, that's fair,
need for that one.
Yeah, fair enough. Cool.
Yeah. Just I generally have the same reaction that you do though, where I look at this, I'm like, yeah, they up-res some of the sprites and like smooth some corners. And then in like the Zelda 1 redrawn, it's like, oh, they like totally ran with what was presented here and like imagined details that were never there to begin with. So I get the same. I get what you're talking about for sure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, with that being said, so all right, let's move out of the dungeon area. And real quick, I know we said best item and music and bloopy trail were going to be ones that were really just hard to like field an entire discussion about. So for that reason, I kind of want to do parts 3, 4, and 5 as a bit of a lightning round where we kind of blow through those pretty quick and then move on to the main feature of this whole thing. Let's go ahead and start with part 3, which is best item. We're going to go Matt to Max and I'll finish out. So Matt, what did you feel was the best item in this game?
The bow and arrow. I used the heck out of bow and arrow when I had the wooden sword and even the white sword, because if I'm not mistaken, the white sword and the bow and arrow have the same damage value. So being able to keep enemies at a distance for the cheap price of 1 rupee per arrow was really great, especially as we got to some of the harder dungeons, 5, 6, 7, 8. It was just invaluable to have. So bow and arrow for me.
Max, how about yourself?
I'm gonna say the raft, because it represents a kind of item that we don't really get in any future Zelda games after this, where it's like it's kind of this passive upgrade, sort of like the Pegasus boots or the Power Glove or something. But it's let's see, trying to put my finger on what it is.
It's an exploration item, not a damage item. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got that, and it's also just it totally like changes how you experience certain areas in like a second to second sort of way. Like it's relevant in combat as a navigation item, not just as a like the Power Glove is like, oh, you can remove an obstacle. This is like, oh, you can move in this space totally differently. I think it's most similar to the Rock's Feather.
Did you mean the ladder?
The ladder, yeah. I was about to say, you mean the ladder?
Sorry. I did mean to say the ladder, not the Rock.
Okay, there you go.
Gotcha.
I was like, how is the rapid combat move?
It all falls into place now.
All right, same page. Actually, that's a great pick. I used the ladder a lot to get myself onto an area where various enemies couldn't hit me, especially in some of the later dungeons where you have some red dark nuts that are running around on the narrow paths. If you just like lay the ladder down and hop off the beaten path, you can hit them from a safe distance without danger of being hit yourself. So yeah, that's a really good pick.
I think your comparison to the Rock's Feather is really interesting, Max, and I like the ladder a lot for similar reasons. And I think obviously the Rock's Feather is a similar item with a little bit more versatility in moment-to-moment gameplay, but then we never really get anything similar to that again. I mean, I know the Oracle games have got like a Rock's Cape or something like that, but it's really something that has kind of fallen out of use in modern Zelda.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree with you there. That's a good pick. My pick is also going to be the bow and arrow in this game. I like it for similar reasons as you do, Matt. But my big reason for picking it is because I really think that there is something to be said for a main combat item that harnesses the power of the massive piles of rupees that we tend to have in Zelda games, right? I think that all recent Zelda games, for the most part, I've always found myself with far more rupees than I could ever use. And the bow and arrow gives you a really interesting way to like it gives you an extra layer to that economy, you know? And kind of helps to incentivize the further collection of rupees and like it gives you like more excitement around when you find more of them. And yeah, for that reason, I really like it. And I think that is something that hasn't ever really been revisited in a meaningful way after this game, and I would love to see it explored again in a future Zelda game. I know we've got like magic armor.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Princess, but who really uses that much? You know?
Yeah, you also, especially in Twilight Princess, the magic armor, you only get it in the last like 2 levels of the game, and then it's more like a cheat code than anything else because it makes you completely invulnerable to damage. So yeah I agree completely. The usage of an already existing economy outside of giving you another ammo counter is also a huge plus.
Yeah, so I really like that for that reason. Okay, so part 4, best music. Obviously, we have a pretty limited soundtrack to work with here, with a few notable ones that kind of go on to become very famous. But Max, I'm going to send this one to you first. What's your favorite piece of music in this game?
So there's a lot of really good music in this game, so it's hard to pick. I'm going to have to pick the overworld theme, though.
It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah, I think if I were to like try to step back and look at this game by itself, there's a reason that became the most iconic piece of music in the whole series, and it's because it's amazing.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think for similar reasons, I'm going to pick the flute music, the tune that plays when you play the flute. There's a reason that it becomes used in pretty much every other Zelda game I can think of off the top of my head. Like it's the beginning point for something that is a recurring theme throughout, and for a very good reason. So flute music for me.
Yeah, and I think it's so funny because that's such a little kind of a cameo piece of music, honestly. Like,
yeah, for us it is. Yeah,
it's such a little bite-sized thing, but I mean, yeah, it's fun, and I definitely had kind of like a Leo DiCaprio pointing at the TV meme moment.
Yes, good meme culture.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've got to go with the overworld theme as well. There are other good ones in here. I actually really like the dungeon soundtrack in this game.
I think I liked it the first couple times, and then after the first couple times, I was like, okay, here we are again.
Fair enough. I do really like it, though. I think it sets a cool tone for, like, especially when you remember that they kind of referred to this game as being split between the overworld, which is a term that gets used a lot in Zelda, but then they didn't really, like, they always called the dungeons the underworld, you know? Like they had it split up that way of like an overworld underworld dynamic, and that kind of nomenclature has not really persisted throughout the rest of the Zelda series. And I think that the piece of music that they have for the dungeons, it's very crypt like, and it definitely feels underworld to me, and I like it for that reason. And then I actually also really like the piece of music for the Death Mountain dungeon as well. I think it's cool, and I like that it is different from all the other dungeons that came before. So. But yeah, I think the clear winner's got to be the overworld theme, right? I mean, truly one of the most classic and enduring pieces of music in all of gaming. You know,
Yep.
It's recognizable to you know, it's transcended. It's transcended this game series, really. You know, like most people who have any passing acquaintance with pop culture would know what that piece of music comes from when they hear it. Maybe not as much as Mario, but pretty close.
Yep.
All right, let's move on to part 5, which is best bloopy trail. Really, there's just honestly almost nothing here. So I'm going to what I'm going to say is that for this one, let's just each say something that we had fun doing that was not relevant to the beating of this game, like just something fun that you did to fill time, you know, moment to moment. I'm going to go first and just say that I really enjoyed. I shouldn't have volunteered myself to go first because I'm realizing that I didn't have a great answer to this just yet. I mean, I guess to me, I really enjoyed just kind of cataloging all the different shop locations and like knowing which ones had different prices on items, and trying to keep a running like memory of which ones those were so that I could come back to them if ever I needed to do that. It's a pretty thin one, but it did give me some amount of extra enjoyment. I just don't think I could really, I don't think there's really anything else that I could really say other than that. I enjoyed looking for heart pieces, you know, the limited amount that there were, but it's there's just really not much there. What about you, Matt? Was there anything that you feel like is appropriate to bring up here?
I would say I enjoyed looking for the sword upgrades. They're not necessary. They're not necessary to the beating of the game, but the hint that, you know, did you go to look behind the waterfall, and then finding the magic sword in the graveyard. Like both of those things were kind of neat to me. So I appreciated those for what they were. I guess my favorite mini game, if we can call it that, was rupee gambling. Was kind of fun
because you enjoyed cheesing it with the rewind.
Yeah, it was pretty great. I wish you could cheese the lottery like that. But it was fun. I also think that was a cool first draft of other rupee mini games that come in later Zelda games, which I always kind of enjoy mini games in Zelda games, especially, you know, any of the shooting galleries in Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask. I love those so much. The pumpkin shooting in Skyward Sword, the bamboo slicing in Skyward Sword, like all of those mini games kind of get their start here with rupee gambling. So honorable mention to rupee gambling.
Yep. What about you, Max?
Well, my answer is probably predictable. My favorite bloopy trail was drawing fan art of my favorite character, which was when I was mapping Hyrule on graph paper. I very much enjoyed that, and when I was doing it, when I was still enjoying it, it was kind of like my number one goal. It was what I cared about the most in the game, was like filling in more spots on my map. So that was by far my favorite bloopy trail, was drawing maps.
I just love that in the absence of a built-in bloopy trail, you created one for yourself. That's true ingenuity right there. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our lightning round, in which we just kind of blow through a lot of the more cursory elements of this game that we just have more to talk about in later installments. Let's get into the main event, which is part 6, which is our final thoughts and ranking of The Legend of Zelda. Of course, we're going to do our ranking at the very end of this discussion. But Max, I would love for you to go ahead and just give us a summary of your final thoughts and experiences with this game.
Oh, yeah, no, big topic, but I love this game as a as a relic of a very different time. Like, to me, it's like a time capsule. I understand what life was like for the game designers back then better, having played this. I understand what life was like better for the players, because I was only 0 years old when this game came out. It's almost the same year I was born. So like, I didn't experience it at the time, and so to me, it's like, it's a vehicle for exploring like a different part of the timeline of this world we all live in. I think it broke so much ground, right? Like, this was a massive, like, genre defining, at the time, masterpiece. Like, it changed the whole industry. And you can kind of feel like it, even though it's aged, like, the same qualities, the same vision that allowed it to achieve that at the time, like, you can still feel it. And it's nice seeing echoes of like, so many things I love about later Zelda games that have been with me all my life are echoes of things that happened in Zelda 1.
Yeah.
Got their start in Zelda 1. So that's super fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Matt, what about yourself? I mean, what give us your top level thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I enjoyed this game so much more than I thought I was going to, and I think that is a direct result of being able to play it in such a way that is not as punishing as it would have been back in the original manifestation, right? Like, the ability to rewind to stop yourself from having to backtrack, the ability to create save states so you're not having to start back at the glade every time you come back to it. Things like that made the game so much more accessible than what it would have been otherwise. And I do, like Max said, I appreciate this game as the origin point, right? It is where everything that we have experienced throughout the entirety of this podcast and through the entirety of all the other games that we've played in this Zelda series and so many other series as well. You can see the starting points here in their infancy, and then seeing how they go from here to what they grow into to become truly like beloved mechanics of an amazing franchise. It was kind of neat to see those starting points. It felt interesting in a good way playing this game so much later and after so many of the other games that we've played, because it almost felt like a prequel, right? It felt like a prequel series in a good way. So yeah, I would say overall, Blush is really positive, and especially way more positive than I thought it was going to be. So pleasant surprise, I guess, is my high level thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of really where I land with it as well. I think, to me, this is always going to be the story of having found a lot of enjoyment in something that I truly didn't think was going to bring me really a lot of that at all. I came away from this whole experience just very grateful for having done it. Like, I truly had a fun little time with this game. I think I got as much out of it as I got more out of it than I ever expected that I could. And I think that a lot of that is just because, even though a lot of the suspicions that I had about what this game would be were borne out in playing it, it was very simplistic. It was very prototypical to a lot of things I like about Zelda. There, was not as much extra stuff to chew on. Those things were all true, but I think that the final package is still actually a very refined little game. Front to back, when taken on the terms, of its original design and intentions, I think that it actually is a great success. And I don't think that it has got too many rough edges, honestly. Like, when you just when you look at what the game was trying to be and what the intention was for it in its original design, I think that it is a success on all fronts. And of course, we will always have the issue of trying to separate that from what the series went on to do and become later. But just taken on its own merits, I think that it is a great little game, and I think that it is absolutely deserving of the legendary status that it has been given. And yeah, I think the greatest compliment that I can really give any game experience is that I enjoyed my time with it. I had fun with it. I had fun with this game. And I really don't know what more, like what more do we really want out of like an expenditure of time in an experience like this?
Bonus question for everybody is, would you play it again?
Max, I'll let you get to that one first.
Yes, I undoubtedly will someday. It'll probably be several years down the line. It'll probably be because something external is prompting me to play it again. Whether it's refresher to talk about it in a podcast again, or me trying to dissect it or analyze it in some way. I don't think it'll ever be a game that I pick up for its own sake.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely not going to be anytime soon. But I can definitely foresee a circumstance in a few years where I choose to pick this game up, and having some base knowledge of it now, embark upon an experience where I try to challenge myself a little bit more with it, play it, like maybe give myself some rules around the playthrough. I can see myself having a good time with that. So I think the simple answer to your question, Matt, is yes, I can see myself playing this game again. Well, now that we've got that out of the way, the time
I didn't answer.
Oh, sorry.
I was opening the whiskey to
Matt,
pour myself another.
And I care about your opinions, and please give us your answer.
Well, now I'm gonna have to pour this first, so you don't have to sit there and listen to it.
Okay, my bad. I deserve everything that's happening right now.
Rude. Gosh. Well, anyway, yes, so my answer is I would not be opposed to playing it again. Much like Max, I don't think that I would just, of my own volition, pick it up to play it back through. Like, while I enjoyed it, I don't see myself just like randomly one day being like, I kind of want to go back through that. Like, it was fun and I liked it and I enjoyed it, and I would not be opposed to playing it again, but on my own, under my own power and influence, I probably wouldn't. Like, if someone was like, hey, we want to talk about it, or if we ever, I don't know if we would ever do this again, but back to front. But yeah, I mean, I would, but not necessarily on my own. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, with all of that out of the way, the time has now come to do what we came here to do, and to rank this game against the others that we have played so far. I kind of reiterated the current ranking as it stands at the top of the episode, but I'm going to go ahead and do it again, just in case anybody forgot. So the ranking as it currently stands is number 5, A Link to the Past. Number 4, Link's Awakening. Skyward Sword is number 3. Number 2 is Ocarina of Time, and number 1 is Breath of the Wild. So here's the way that we do this, Max, because you have not been on a ranking episode with us before. The way that we typically do this is Matt and I raise hands, and I read the list in order of lowest to highest. And if you do not like this game more than the one that I read off, then you drop your hand. And if more than if we have a majority who drops their hands, then that's where the game falls. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool.
We might need you on camera for this one.
No, he can just tell. He can just tell
say
us
yes or no.
He can just tell us if he drops it.
Oh, well, that's less fun than the dramatic pause and then the exclamations. But
the assumption is that my hand is up already, and I say I drop it, or I drop
Correct.
my hand, or whatever. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
Hands in the air.
Hands in the air. All right. Max and Matt, do you like The Legend of Zelda more than A Link to the Past?
I dropped my hand.
Matt and I dropped our hands.
Unanimous.
There it is. Didn't take
Unanimous.
long. That was a quick and swift knockout. So there you have it. The new Sacred Realms ranking is as follows. Number 1 is Breath of the Wild. Number 2 is Ocarina of Time. Number 3 is Skyward Sword. Number 4 is Link's Awakening. Number 5 is A Link to the Past. And number 6 is The Legend of Zelda, which I don't think is any great surprise to any of us. That's pretty much where I figured it was going to net out. I do have to apologize, Max, because I know that like as this list gets larger and larger, we're going to run into an issue where like you personally, I don't know, I'm not speaking for you, but you may like The Legend of Zelda more than Skyward Sword, but you might like it less than A Link to the Past. And so it's like, our previous ranking has kind of like messed this up a little bit for you, but we've got to respect the ranking as it stands. So.
That's kind of weird. And I think when we get to the end of our 13 or 14 season run, we'll have to do like a huge sidebar panel discussion about like, do we need to reshuffle this in any way, shape, or form? So that might come. Well, I don't know. We've got a long ways to go to get there, so we'll see what happens.
It's not like I need my opinion reflected in the official Sacred Realms ranking or anything like that. Maybe you two can do a bonus episode every 8 games or something and reevaluate the whole list.
That's not a bad idea, actually.
And we may just do that. Out of curiosity, would you have put this above any of the games that are higher up on our ranking currently?
I might have put it above Skyward Sword.
I knew you were going to say it, and it hurts my soul every time.
I'm saying that just to get a rise out of Matt.
I
know. Motives here.
It worked. It did. It works every time.
Honestly, if I were to sit down and play a game right now for fun, I would probably pick a Skyward Sword dungeon over Zelda 1. And a Skyward Sword dungeon would take as long as playing all of Zelda 1. So.
Yes, it would.
Yeah. I think there was a dark corner of my mind where I very briefly considered maybe I did enjoy this game more than A Link to the Past. And upon further reflection, that's not true. I don't enjoy it more than A Link to the Past. But I do think that there is there's a streamlined quality. There's a certain there's a certain impressive brevity to this game that A Link to the Past doesn't have. I think as a very streamlined, quirky little experience, this game is really wonderful. It's a quick breath of fresh air. It's bite-sized fun. I don't think that makes it a better game than A Link to the Past, but I do think that was one thing that I really did enjoy about it, and I had to think about it for a minute. But I just think that I don't think many people are going to find this to be a controversial opinion. I think that for everything that this game does well, it is still the first of its kind, and basically everything that it does has been bettered in some way by games that came after. And that's not a knock on this game at all. Everything has to start somewhere, and I think this is an excellent starting point. But yeah, just in terms of like the pure fun factor, like where would I choose to allocate my gaming time? I do think that it does stand at the bottom of the list as it currently stands. So
yeah, and not to say that Link to the Past overstays its welcome, but Link to the Past is a verbose game. Like, there's a lot to it. It was one of our longest seasons. It's like 13 or 14 episodes. There was a lot of dungeons. There was a lot going on there. And I found myself sometimes in Link to the Past thinking like, is this filler content super necessary? Was that last dungeon like really needed to be in there? And I never found myself asking that particular question of this game, which, in an era of gaming where everything is open world, everything takes 80 to 100 hours to complete, everything is complex and time consuming and difficult in many ways. It was kind of nice to have a game that knew what it was, knew what it wanted to accomplish, and just went out and did it and didn't make much of a fuss about it. And I appreciate that about it. Like, I don't think that that's a bad thing in any way.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got me curious, so I just looked it up. The speedrun record for Link to the Past with no major glitches, any percent, is 1 hour and 22 minutes, 58 seconds.
Wow. That's fast.
Zelda 1, it is 27 minutes and 54 seconds.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I mean, it's good. It's good. It really is. We've said it a lot. There is no such thing as a bad Zelda game. And even being at the current bottom of our ranking list, this is not a bad Zelda game, and it's not a bad game.
I think that the last thing that I want to say about my thoughts on this is that this is probably the most prestigious sixth place award that I've ever given to anything. Right? Like, I mean, like I think that this is a very, this game has achieved a lot. And like, I don't think that this 6th place is like is a knock at all. I also don't think that this game is going to be the bottom of our ranking when all is said and done. I think
Really?
that, I maybe that's a little optimistic. I don't know, but I would be willing to say that I think this might end up being more fun to me overall than some other things that we kind of play down the road. Not many, but I think there's some entries that are really going to have to fight with this game to gain a higher ranking on the list.
Yeah, I totally agree. Especially having been so pleasantly surprised by it, I think is giving it a way more of a leg up than we thought it would.
Yes.
And like, I'm always happy to be wrong, and we do our absolute best to go into every single one of these games with minimal preconception, with minimal subjectivity. We try to be as objective as possible, and we try to give every game a fair shake. But, I definitely can see myself looking at a game, say maybe Spirit Tracks or something, and maybe not enjoying that as much as the experience that I've had with Legend of Zelda. Again, not to say that it's a bad game. I've never even played it, so I don't know. But, that's just like the very first one that comes to my mind that I'm like, I don't really want to play that one. And while I would say that we went into this season kind of dreading it, it wasn't that we didn't want to play it, is that we were scared of how hard it would be. And so not having that pan out in quite the way that we expected it to is definitely giving it an advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. Max, do you have any final thoughts that you want to give before we wrap this thing up?
No, not really. I think we've covered most of the ground here.
I think that I agree. I think that we thoroughly canvassed the topic. We all got something out of this. Onward we march to an even greater challenge.
Adventure of Link, here we come.
Oh boy. Okay, I guess that means I actually need to come up with the episode schedule for that one.
I think you guys are going to have a blast with Adventure of Link. We'll see, but I think you will.
Okay.
You know what? Speak it into the universe, Max. So you have said it, so shall it be. That's my optimistic thought.
You're gonna have a blast or else.
Yeah.
Joshua ZU will come to your house.
He will. He has said so himself. Yes.
Joshua ZU lives close enough to come to our house if we cross him. So definitely don't want that to happen. Yeah, I need to sit down with him and be like, okay, help me organize this next game. So we'll get that done sooner rather than later. Well, everybody, that concludes this installment of the Sacred Realms recap. We will, of course, do this one more time in Season 6 when we discuss our final thoughts on Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. It's going to be a great time. We're going to complete our 8-bit journey and then move on from there to what after that? Who can tell?
Our patrons.
Our patrons can tell.
They will tell us what we're doing next.
Here I was hoping that we were going to have a Switch installment of The Wind Waker to help generate some excitement around that next voting process, but nope.
Yeah, that's not happening.
Dang it, Nintendo.
Just give me what I want.
Just want one thing. I actually want many things.
I was about to say, that's not true. Yeah. We want many things out of Nintendo.
Cool. Well, Max, we appreciate so much you coming on to this episode and helping us to get yet another Zelda game ranked against the rest of the ones that we played. I know that we ask you every time that you come on where people can follow you, and I would like to believe that most of our patrons and listeners have already taken advantage of that. But just in case they haven't, please drop some social handles, let people know where they can follow you and everything you're up to.
Yes, gladly. So you can find myself as an individual on Twitter with the handle @Max Nichols. More interest to a lot of listeners probably is Hyrule Interviews, which is HyruleInterviews.com or Hyrule Interview on Twitter. And Hyrule Interviews is basically a database that I maintain of where I try to collect every Zelda interview that has ever been. Or every interview with a Zelda creator. It is far from complete, but I have hundreds of interviews and thousands of quotes, and my Twitter handle for it posts daily quotes, which may be of interest to many of you. So that's where you can find me.
Well, there you go.
Also, credits for Destiny 2 sometimes, but it's a little harder to pick me out of the crowd.
And, I would say it's probably a bit more fun in your day-to-day to get into Zelda discourse than it is Destiny 2 discourse, just given that that's your profession and what you spend your 9 to 5 doing, right?
Well, I won't be talking about it on Twitter, that's for sure.
That's wise. That's very wise. So if you enjoy all the tidbits of wisdom and little excerpts and anecdotes that Max brings to the table every time he comes on the show, and you would like a little bit of an extra dose of that, then head over to Hyrule Interviews and take a deep dive, because something tells me that what Max has given us on this show is barely scratching the surface of what is available to be gleaned over there. So go give that a shot. It's great work that he's doing, and I'm really, really glad that somebody's doing it. Okay. Y'all ready to get out of here?
I am ready. It is 11:30 at night. Let's do it.
Sounds good. Max, it's been a great time. We will catch you again very soon. Hopefully in Zelda 2 sometime. We'll reconvene and we'll talk more about this 8-bit Zelda journey.
I look forward to it.
Awesome. So do we. Well, y'all, if you enjoyed today's show and you would like a little extra Sacred Realms in your life, you can head over to patreon.com/Sacred Realms Pod and you can become a patron. If you've got no rupees, it's not a problem. 5-star Apple Podcast reviews are a great free way to support us. More reviews means that more people see our show. That makes us very happy Hylians. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Sacred Realms Pod for updates on the podcast and for behind the scenes action. Sacred Realms will be back next Wednesday with our thoughts on the game intro of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. We'd love for you to play along with us and to share your thoughts on our social channels. The Adventure of Link can be played in a variety of places. It can be played in its original form on the Nintendo NES. It can be played on the Nintendo NES Mini. It can be played on a variety of eShops. And, of course, it can be played on the Nintendo Switch online service, which is the way that Matt and I are playing it. But in the meantime, may your hearts be full. May your arrows never miss. We will catch y'all next time. Sacred Realms is an independent podcast production which is produced, edited, and mixed by me, Lyndon Willoughby. Our music comes from Zelda and Chill by Mikkel and is graciously provided to us by Mikkel and Game Chops Records. Zelda and Chill is available to stream on Spotify or to purchase directly from GameChops.com. Finally, our thanks go to Nintendo for creating such exceptional and innovative experiences.